I think it could go even further and just see it as health, because mental health is essentially physical health.
Matt Haig, you've got a complicated relationship with Ibiza. Obviously, it was central to your best-selling memoir, and you've now returned there in fictional form. Just explain why.
Yeah, I've got a very complicated relationship because as a young, foolish person, I was the typical Ibiza cliche in the 90s. Lots of unhealthy lifestyle, drinking, drugs, and I ended up quite ill for all sorts of reasons in 1999, and I was suicidal there. So coming back was quite a sort of cathartic thing. That was like 20 years later. For years, I couldn't actually go there, couldn't face the idea of it. It was easy to leave the past behind by leaving the place behind. And it was only quite recently when I was actually, for the first time in my life, having therapy. I should have had years before. I thought, you know what, I need to go back to the place when I was at my worst, when I was at my most insecure, when I was in the midst of panic disorder and depression. So I went back there. And while I was there, after not having written anything for over a year, I had this idea for a story about transformation and about healing. And yeah, it was very much associated with that
Because
experience.
in a way it was sort of therapy for you going back there, but also therapy for your central character in a funny kind of way of the life impossible.
Yeah, no, totally. And I deliberately chose a central character who wasn't the Ibiza cliche, you know, a retired maths teacher who's grieving, and the last person she would think of as going to Ibiza, but she goes there because she's left or bequeathed, to use a fancy word, a house on the island by a friend she hasn't seen since the 1970s. So she's wondering, why is this person left of his house? What's happened to his friend? Has she died? And so she goes over to investigate, and it becomes a very sort of weird, strange tale of transformation and superpowers, and all kinds of weird things happen to her. But essentially, it's a tale of sort of like healing and recovery. And it's a fantasy, I think, because the reality of healing and of coming out of any sort of like trauma or experience, in my experience, always has a sort of surreal edge to it. So I wanted to, you know, it felt like the most realistic way to do that.
And you know, she's a maths teacher, so sort of hyper rational.
Yeah.
And yet it's kind of magical realism. I mean, it's a bit like Alice in Wonderland, believing six impossible things before breakfast, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always get, you know, it starts off quite realistically, but I always get a little bit bored of like staying within realism. And I think if you're making up something, you might as well really make up something. So for me, it just felt the most natural way to tell this story, to go a little bit wild in the middle.
And you've talked about taking a break from writing. Your previous book, The Midnight Library, was a huge success. In a funny kind of way, that came at a huge personal cost, didn't it, to yourself?
Well, you know, it wasn't solely to do with that. I think I was having like a little bit of a crisis. I mean, like lots of people, this was during the sort of like first year of the pandemic, had a lot of things going on. I hadn't drank for years, and I'd started drinking again, and I was a little bit lost and feeling the depression coming in. It wasn't quite like what I'd known 20 years previously, but I was having that. And then on top of that, I was in a situation where I should have been very grateful and very happy for everything, and I just wasn't feeling that, and I was having all sorts of crises. And I thought, maybe it's writing, maybe I should be something else. And so I, you know, gave up writing for a year or so, and I went out into the real world, had like a cliched idea of maybe setting up a bookshop or a sober bar, which I live in Brighton. That's quite cliche for Brighton to set up a sober bar in Brighton. But I didn't really know. I was a bit lost. And yeah, the Midnight Library doing that, and everyone thinking you should be having a time of your life, which I probably should have been, but I wasn't, you know, it was a very strange time. But it actually, in the end, made me realize I want to write for the right reasons, and it's not, you know, not about the public-facing side of it so much. It's about, you know, writing for myself and writing the sort of strange stuff I want to write. And I find a kind of like cliche alert therapy in that as well.
But I mean, going back to Ibiza and facing those demons, how hard was that in the end? You described it as cathartic, but how difficult was it?
Well, it was made easier by the fact that it was April. So it was out of tourist season, and it was overcast skies. No nightclubs were open, very few tourists about. So it wasn't the Ibiza of the sort of public reality TV imagination. It was the sort of quieter, more natural place that it can be and is largely when you go there. And so it was very interesting to go back to like the cliffs where I'd been my most ill and nearly took my life, and seeing all that as a different person. You know, over 2 decades had passed, the islands changed, I'd changed, and so it was like finally facing up to the place and the person I used to be, and it was quite a healing, a beefing kind of vibe, yeah.
So you actually went to the spot where you almost
Yeah,
jumped.
well, it was right back there. We were staying quite close by, and the spot where it was, because we used to live near the cliffs, and so yeah, I went there, and you know, it was a big moment, but it wasn't a moment at all, because I felt so distant and detached, and it was just another patch of sort of scrubland, and it was a very strange, big nothing in the end. So it was a very weird thing, and it made me realise that, you know, I'm very much at a different place in life. I wouldn't say I'm 100% perfectly mentally well all the time, but, you know, very different to that sort of young person I'd been.
And this was part of a journey of, I guess, self-discovery. You've talked about therapy for the first time, and you also were diagnosed as an adult with ADHD and autism. How much of a difference has that diagnosis made to you?
Well, on a personal level, it's made quite a big difference. I'm not going to go out there and become something like spokesperson for autism or anything, but because I'm still working it all out myself, and it just made a lot of sense for me. And it's a massively overused word, mindfulness, but I think it's given me like pause and reflection in my own behaviours, particularly the ADHD one. I think that impulsive thing, do I need to do that? Do I need to post that tweet? Do I need to be rash? Do I need to have that drink? And it gives you that, you think, oh no, it's the ADHD. So in that sense, it's been useful. But it's bittersweet in midlife when you get a diagnosis. You know, I was told at school I was special needs, but I was never told what those needs were. I was never told, you know, what the special in special needs was. And people didn't have the answers back then, but I was always just seen as a little bit different. But getting the diagnosis, you know, it unlocks a lot of things, but you think, but if I'd have known 30, 40 years ago, would it have made a difference?
Well, yeah, I wonder, I mean, the Midnight Library deals with alternative stories of your protagonist's life. I mean, could you have had an alternative story if you had been diagnosed earlier? Would things have panned out differently?
Possibly. I mean, I was given medication when I had my diagnosis, and I did sort of change a lot of things. And I think I'd have been a bit kinder to myself, because my thing when I was younger was I was always trying to fit in, but never feeling like I would fit in. I remember sort of problematic behaviours, like I got arrested for shoplifting when I was 16 years old. And I was a compulsive shoplifter before then, and then obviously with drinking drugs, which led in, you know, so you think now, looking at the Venn diagram of ADHD and those sort of behaviours when it's undiagnosed, you know, it's quite high. So, yeah, possibly, but I don't know. And a big theme of my work is sort of not drowning in regret. So I try to not do that with my own life too. I
mean, there is an NHS task force looking at the huge increase in diagnoses of ADHD. For example, there are some warnings that private clinics are over-diagnosing or even misdiagnosing it. Is that a legitimate cause for concern, or is there something liberating about people having the confidence and the courage to get a diagnosis in a way that could be life-changing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't go around waking up every day thinking, oh, I'm an ADHD person. It was just a sort of diagnosis I was given. I think basically there's just been a massive problem of underdiagnosis for years and decades. It's not the case that, you know, probably are people who are diagnosed miscorrectly, and you know, all these things are evolving over time. But I think it's good to actually understand that these previously invisible things are now being seen, and if it gives comfort to people, if it helps people, if it gives people the right medication that they've never had, then obviously that's a positive thing.
And then, you know, the new government has made a big point of saying that mental health should be treated on a par with physical health, children's mental health in particular, a key focus. Are you encouraged by that, or do you worry that there isn't resources to handle that the NHS is so overstretched it can't cope with the level of diagnosis in this area?
Well, that's certainly the case at the moment. I mean, with neurodiversity, with mental health, that has been the case. It's been starved of resources for over a decade. And yeah, there's a big, massive problem, but obviously it's good that these noises and speeches are being made now, you know, and let's see going forward. But the fact that they're drawing attention to it has to be a positive sign. And the idea of physical health, having mental health having parity with physical health has got to be a good thing. I mean, I think it could go even further and just see it as health, because mental health is essentially physical health. You know, our brains are physical things, our nervous system is physical things. It is health, and it's all equally important because, you know, as I and millions of other people know, it can really impact your life in long-lasting ways. So yes, it's great that this is happening.
And you talked about impulsive tweets and that kind of thing. And I just wondered the role that social media has played in your own mental health challenges.
Well, yeah, again, when, you know, as someone who's been had addictive problems with alcohol, I think 10 years from now, we are going to realize even more than we do right now, social media should probably come with its own government health warnings, and, you know, things that aren't necessarily substance can still be addictive, can still change behavior. In my own case, I used to waste far too much of my life arguing with people online, and I really try not to do that anymore. I am back online, but
you're back in a very sort of controlled way.
Yeah,
is that you tweeting?
I'm not back arguing on Twitter. Yeah, it's always me, but yeah, I took a year off. Actually, when I wrote this book, I was away from social media, and I think it helped this book happen. But I think there's a challenge for writers and people generally now competing with social media, especially like books, this quiet media form, this quiet, calm media form. How do we write for this age in 2024 of distraction and a continual entertainment and stimulation? And I think that's a challenge for writers. And that might be, you know, if you've got a little bit of an attention problem yourself, it might help you address that.
You really think that in terms of, you know, health warnings, social media is as problematic, as addictive as, you know, smoking or alcohol? It should have that kind of level of alarm.
Yeah, I mean, unlike smoking, there's a positive side to it. And, you know, so it's a complicated picture, and, you know, there's aspects of social media that have been really great and good, and it's great to get your message about, and people who wouldn't have been discovered in the past can now be discovered because they can get their work out there, their music out there. So I think for creators that is a very much a positive side. But in terms of mental health, neurosis, continual comparison of comparing yourself to other people, that stuff needs to be addressed, especially for young people and teenagers, and, you know, the dangers therein.
But for you personally, being sort of slightly removed from social media, as you put it, how good is that?
Yeah, I have a much better understanding that when I'm starting to feel anxious or depressed or whatever it is, then that's, as with stopping drinking, you know, to step away or to have a totally different relationship, or as I did for a short while, have someone else do it on your behalf. That's helpful.
Matt Haig, thanks very much.
Thanks, Kathy.
And if you have been affected by any of the issues in that interview, you can, of course, seek help by going to channel4.com/support.